Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous, and this is part 28 of a 10-part video series where we're exploring how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. In the previous 3 videos, we've been taking a look at how messy things can be if you're not using configurations. In this video, we're finally going to start using configurations and configuration elements and configuration attributes to make our life a whole lot easier. So let's jump in and take a look. Again, quick reminder here, you know the story. Our hypothetical example here is we're creating an Orchestrator workflow that we're developing and testing in our test dev environment, but we ultimately want to promote that workflow into our production environment. Notice in this diagram, we have different ranges of IP addresses for the different environments, and those need to change depending upon where we're running our workflow. So over to our lab environment. Here's our new workflow called, finally, an example using configuration attributes. As you can see, this workflow schema is simpler than the previous workflow. Let's go back to the previous one real quickly here. The previous workflow schema had to have a separate branch for doing things in test dev as opposed to doing things in production. Our new workflow just has a single branch which can handle both cases. You'll notice the way we've got this set up here is that each schema element, like our previous video, each schema element has access to the IP address values it needs by virtue of the variable binding that we've done between our workflow attributes and the variables within the schema element. So this is just like the previous video, although actually one thing's different. Notice in this case here, in the new workflow, instead of having to have 6 different workflow attributes, now we only need 3. And what's going to happen here is these values are going to change for the production environment or test dev environment, but we only need 3 different variables. So let's go to the General tab and see those variables, those workflow attributes. We have 3 workflow attributes called web server IP address, SMTP server IP address, and SSH server IP address. And currently these attributes have their values hard-coded, which is what we want to move away from. Anytime we hard-code values, even if we do it all in one place, like in attributes in the workflow, anytime you hard-code values within a workflow, you're going to run into that type of situation that we talked about in the previous video, where that's fine, technique-wise, that's fine if you're working with one workflow, but if you're hard-coding anything into multiple workflows, cleaning that mess up later on if that value needs to change is a pain. So here's what we're going to do. In our lab environment, I have my new workflow, but I don't want to hard code these values for these workflow attributes in the workflow itself. So instead, what I'm going to do is go to the Configurations tab. And as you can see, when you first go in here, you see the root object, but let's expand. And you can see we have a bunch of different folders. For instance, this library folder was created by VMware when you first deployed vRealize Orchestrator. And additional configuration folders can be created by folks such as the folks that create plugins. But most important for us, you can create your own configuration folder, and we recommend you do so that you can keep your stuff and our stuff apart. Keeps things nice and clean. So I'm going to right-click, choose New Folder, and I'm going to create a folder called VVork. You'll probably call yours by your name or your company name, but create yourself a folder. And if you want to, you can right-click your folder and create subfolders if you need to have some sort of hierarchical organization. But for our purposes here, a single folder is fine. So instead of right-clicking and choosing New Folder, what I'm going to do is choose New Element. This is going to create a new configuration element, which you'll recall, that's a container-like object that we use to store multiple configuration attributes. So the configuration element is the container of configuration attributes. So let's create a configuration element by choosing New Element. We'll give it a name. Why don't we give it an exciting name like example, let me capitalize that, example configuration element number 1. Maybe I'll do another one later on. But I'll say example configuration element number 1 because this is the first configuration element I'm creating. I click OK, and you'll notice when I click OK, we're going to immediately be taken into edit mode. So boom, right in edit mode. And if we go to the configuration elements general tab, we can see the name of the configuration element. If we want to use versioning on configuration elements, you can do that just like you can with workflows and actions and so forth. And there are other things we can do, but I want to zero in right away on this description field. You should type a good description here. I'll show you why that matters here shortly. Now, I'm going to go ahead and paste in. You don't have to read this whole description here. I'm just setting this up so that when I save this configuration element and all my workflows into the VVork examples package, I'll have the usual CYA stuff down here on the bottom. But ignoring that, if I just do that, if I just name my configuration element and type a description and save and close, I now have a configuration element. Here it is, but it has no attributes. So go to the attributes tab and it's blank. So let's create some attributes by going to the edit button, going to the attributes tab, and we create attributes by hitting a familiar looking button, the A+ button that adds attributes. Just like when you're in a workflow and you go to the general tab to create workflow attributes, you hit this button. For configuration elements, you go to the attributes tab, hit this button once, twice. I'll do it 3 times because I want to have 3 different configuration attributes. Now I'm going to give each configuration attribute a name, and I'm going to, for the sake of clarity here, I'm going to break my usual naming convention. Normally for all of my workflow variables, action variables, for all my configuration element attribute variables, I always use camel case. But in this case here, I'm going to capitalize the names of my configuration attributes so that later on it'll be really clear to you whether the variable name you're seeing is a workflow attribute, those will be in camel case, or a configuration attribute, which will be in uppercase like I'm about to do here. So I'm going to create my first configuration attribute, and I'm going to call it web server IP address. I'm going to get lazy here and copy and paste it a little bit so I don't have to keep typing that. So I name my configuration attribute. I set its type, and I hard code a value. But whereas before we were hard coding values into our workflow, now we're hard coding the value into the configuration repository, that one singular repository, the only place I'll ever have to go to again if ever the value changes. So let's see here. I'm going to start off by picking either to set these 3 up as test dev IP addresses or set them up as production. Let's see, flip a virtual coin, tails. So we'll do test dev values first. So 192.168.1.1 for my web server, and I already know what the next 2 are going to be. So 192.168.1.2 for my SMTP server, and 192.168.1.3 for my email, my SSH server. So again, let me set these names up. This one's going to be called SMTP server IP address, and this one's going to be called SSH server IP address. So for each of those 3 configuration attributes, I have set their values. I've hard-coded them in the repository. Now I should always type good descriptions. Again, I'll show you shortly here why this description matters, but let's see, this first one's going to be my web server IP address. I'm going to type that multiple times, so let me copy and paste. This one will be SMTP server IP address, and the third one's going to be SSH server IP address. So that's all it takes. And notice in this particular example here, I'm only setting up the 3 IP addresses for test dev. Later on, if I want my workflows to switch to using production server IP addresses, I'll come back here and I'll change the IP addresses. Now, for sake of illustration here, I'm going to create one more variable. I'm going to call this one whatever. And instead of making it a string or a simple data type like a string or a number or a Boolean, this time I'm going to intentionally choose to create something fancier like a configuration attribute that's a VC::virtual machine object. because I'm not limited to simple data types. I can use any data type that I want, such as VC virtual machine. And just like the other configuration attributes that we saw up above, I'm going to set this one's value. I'm going to hard code it in the repository by clicking not set. Here comes the tree browser. In the tree browser, I'm just going to drill down and pick any old virtual machine. It doesn't really matter. In fact, I'm going to speed up the video here. So as you can see, I've selected a specific virtual machine. Doesn't matter which virtual machine, I'm just picking a VM. And I click select. And to really drive home the point, I'm going to set this guy's description up with a bad description. Again, we don't want bad descriptions, we want good descriptions. And then I'll click save and close. And now I have my first configuration attribute, and currently it has in it 4 different configuration attributes. So I set up my configuration element. I may have said that wrong. Here's my configuration element, and it has 4 different configuration attributes. Only the first 3 I care about. Okay, so let's go back to our new workflow. So we go to the Workflows tab, and in the Workflows tab, I select my workflow, and I'll hit the Edit button. And in here, instead of hard coding these values, I want to link these workflow attributes to configuration attributes in the configuration repository. So I'm going to go over here to the configurations column. Remember, this icon's for configurations. And in this column, we see 2 buttons, one of which you're going to intuitively understand without me even explaining in a few moments. But this other button over here, which is a little less intuitive, is the crucial button. If I had drawn the picture for these buttons, I would have made it look like chain links, because this strange looking button allows you to create a link between your workflow attribute and an attribute in the configuration repository. You just simply click the button, and in the top of the interface here, you will see a list of all the configuration elements. Now, I can use filtering to find the configuration element that I'm looking for. Or, of course, if you wanted to, you could just go scrolling through the list. I'll do that once to illustrate. So I could go scrolling through the list and find the configuration element that I'm interested in. So here's the configuration element, and notice that the configuration element description here is actually nice and descriptive. If instead, maybe I can find one that doesn't have a good description. If instead, there we go. This one here this configuration element called token states has no description, and therefore whoever's thinking of using that configuration element has no clue what that configuration element is for. So make certain you type good descriptions for both your configuration attribute and the configuration, for both the configuration element and your configuration attribute should also have good names. So I'm going to select my configuration element called example configuration element. And you'll notice that we see our 4 different configuration attributes plus their excellent descriptions, except for one. Remember, you don't want to type a bad description, you want to type a good description. The other thing you may have noticed here, right from the get-go, is that it's showing all 4 attributes, but notice only 3 are showing up in black text. This last one is grayed out. And the reason why that is when you say, I want to create a link to this workflow variable that's of type string, vRealize vRealize Orchestrator will automatically gray out any configuration attributes that are not of the same type. So I can't possibly set this string workflow variable and connect it to this vC virtual machine variable. Can't do it. But what I can do is, let's see, I've got the right type here, but I need to make certain, let's see, web server IP address, great. I'm going to link my workflow attribute to this configuration attribute. Click select, and then I'll just do that for the other 2 configuration for the other two workflow attributes. So for the workflow attribute called SMTP server IP address, I'm going to click the button. Up pops the interface. Scroll or filter to find your configuration element. And select the appropriate configuration attribute. And then I'll do that one more time. Click the button for our third workflow attribute called SSH server IP address. In the interface that pops up, why don't we do filtering this time? We'll find our configuration element, select it. Type filtering will help us to find the right one. We just need to pick the right string configuration attribute. Select that one and click select. And now my three workflow variables are linked to three different configuration attributes. Let me say that slightly different. My three workflow attributes are linked to three different configuration attributes. Now, take a moment, if you would, to study here in the value column where we used to see hard-coded values. Please note that if we are doing linking to a configuration attribute, we'll see the configuration icon here on the left. And then you'll see element name, configuration element name, colon, configuration attribute name. So that way, if you're using configuration attributes from different elements, it'll be real clear which is coming from where. Now, you guys know what this first button does. The next button next to it, the X button, is obviously used for severing the link, unlinking, so that you can go back to hard coding values, which is not what we want. In this case here, we want the links so that in our workflow, let's go look at our schema again. In our workflow, now the way things are currently set up, if we run this workflow, the workflow attributes are bound to configuration attributes that have test dev IP addresses. So if I run this workflow, in fact, let's do that, we're going to see IP addresses that are in the test dev network, 192.168. whatever. So let's actually verify that by going to the logs tab, and notice here in the logs tab that we see test dev IP addresses. Excellent. Now, if we want to promote this workflow into our production environment, we'll simply save and close our workflow. Then we're going to go over to the configurations tab. And in the configurations tab, we're just going to go back to our configuration element and change the values of our configuration attributes. So I've selected my configuration element. I'll click edit. And now, again, I'm just going to change the hard-coded IP addresses. So for this first one, I'm going to change it to 172.16.1.1. And I don't want to have to type all these again, so I'm just going to copy and paste. And change these values. And while I'm in here, I'm going to go ahead and delete this oddball out here. So this configuration attribute called whatever, I'm never planning on using it. I'm just going to delete it. And I now have my three configuration attributes with new values assigned to them. And as a result, when I save and close my configuration attribute, and I then go back to my workflow, and I run my workflow, when I run my workflow this time, the workflow runs like before, but this time when I go to the logs tab, notice that all the IP addresses are production IP addresses. So from now on, whether I'm promoting the workflow from test dev into production, or maybe I'm still running the workflow in the same environment, but the IP addresses have changed for any reason, all I have to do from here on out in this workflow is go to the configurations tab and do what I just showed you. And furthermore, if I use this same linking to configuration attribute technique in other workflows, then all of my workflows that are using these values can be changed very, very quickly. I just go to the configurations tab, change the values of my configuration attributes, and then suddenly all of my workflows benefit from our configuration attributes. So in the previous 3 videos, we showed you why you want to use configuration attributes, but now you've actually seen them in action, and hopefully you can see how these are so very useful. What else is useful that we'll be talking about in the next video is how to use configuration elements, but to interact with them programmatically. That one's actually really interesting, so I'll see you over in the next video.